So welcome to Conversation 360 and this series, Asia and the West. Angela, it's so much fun to talk to you again. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's great to see you back on our shores.
Well, thank you. And when did you come to Asia? I know you've been here for eons, but when did you get here from Australia?
Well, you could almost say, no, that's as a very interesting semantic argument in many ways. Is Australia part of Asia? I suppose it's a little bit like the lace on somebody's petticoat. It's just sort of down the end of the the garment. But I was born in Australia, yes, in Sydney, and then I expelled myself to London, and I came here to Hong Kong 21 years ago from London. I was working there as a foreign correspondent for an Australian newspaper at that stage, and then came here in 1995, and that was very exciting for myself and my husband because we were both journalists, and this was going to be a big story, the 1997 handover back to China.
Indeed. So you've really been here for enough time to really see the shift in all the things that are happening between Asia and the West. Specifically, China is the thing that we're especially interested in. So when I say we're talking about the conversations that take place in and between Asia and the West, but specifically China, what does that bring to mind for you? What does that mean, the conversations going on between Asia and the West?
Well, the conversations have changed dramatically because I don't think there's as much apologising, as much modesty about the way Asia is portraying itself. I think even the Asian pearls were quite surprised during the late 90s when it was talking about all these tiger economies and how it was going to be their century, the 21st century, and then of course we had the Asian financial crisis and that doused that fire pretty comprehensively for a while. But then we got to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and then suddenly that was a great leveller. And it meant that a lot of Asian economies had a chance to catch up again with the West, which was floundering around, some would say philosophically as well as financially, following the global financial crisis.
So true.
So I noticed that there was an increase of confidence. There was an increase in, I think there was a little bit more bellicose talk as well, particularly out of China. We saw China finally emerge with its first aircraft carrier. And when you've got the biggest army in the world, it's funny that you don't end up with an aircraft carrier to be able to get them around the Pacific. So you're starting to see China assert itself in militarily in a way that is obvious to an international audience. So I think that has been another thing that I've noticed particularly. And of course you've got all the conflict and arguments about the disputed land masses, natural and man-made, in the South China Sea. And also you're seeing China and also Japan starting to figure out that they have to position themselves on a global stage, carve out a niche that is a solid niche, not something that's quite so Confucian, not quite so fluid. And it's interesting to see Abe in Hawaii this week at Pearl Harbor. It's interesting to see how China is going to cope with somebody who's probably just as fluid as they would like to be, Donald Trump. I think that is going to be like a several dozen PhD topics is probably being set up as we speak in Beidar University around him, how he came to power and how he's going to wield it. So those kind of conversations are new and are going to change a lot of the rules of engagement between China and the East and the West. And I think that there is a sense I've certainly felt it here, particularly in China, and also travelling through Indochina, Vietnam in particular. You feel it's a little bit of an end of an empire sense on the other side of the Pacific. I wasn't at APEC this year, but friends of mine who were journalists and also speakers were, and they said there was a real shift in focus and emphasis, and who were the people that had the longest interview lists, the people who were commanding most airtime on and off the stage.
And they were?
They were from this region. They were coming from East Asia. So there is a sense that maybe this century is going to be the Asian century. It's just started a little bit late.
So how does this recent slowdown in China, what impact does that have? How does that fit into all of this?
Well, it's a slowdown. It's a slowdown you have when you're not really having a slowdown, is how I think about it. I mean, a lot of people, for example, if you just move back to Japan for a second, Japan had zero, even negative growth for years and years and years, and still does.
True.
But I don't see their lives being particularly impacted. I mean, if that's the new normal, is that such a bad thing? Of course, Japan doesn't have the same kind of political balancing act that China has. But for China, obviously a certain amount of economic growth, and I don't know what the magic number is, but I assume it's probably between 7 and 10%, is required to keep the wheels on the bus, because you have the rich and poor divide, the rural, the urban divide, and you need to be able to keep enough people in jobs to ensure that there is political harmony, at least on the surface. So that's the most important equation, I think, in China, and it has been for the last decade, I'm sure.
Harmony is an interesting word that you use, because that's the one they use, isn't
yeah,
it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that there will be infrastructure spending. They will just invest in infrastructure. They've done it before, and that will mean keep lots of public works, lots more highways, lots more airports, bridges, etc., to make sure that there is sufficient employment, particularly in rural areas, to keep the engine of growth puttering along. I think that what's going to be interesting in China, which was the workshop of the West, is what happens when we find what increasing mechanization is going to do to those big factories like Foxconn. I mean, you think about how much their workforce is going to decline simply because of robots, more artificial intelligence being used in construction of all of Apple's products or whoever's products they're making in those factories. So on one hand, you got a lot of investment going in to keep people in jobs by the central authorities, but on the other hand, capitalism is taking those jobs away because you're finding that there's cheaper, more efficient ways of having these tasks carried out, and that's by robots. I think I read something, might have been in my own august organ, the FT, about 20% of Foxconn's employees being replaced by robots, or robotisation, if that's such a word, by the end of 2017. So that's another...
That's big.
Yeah, that's another factor that I think the Chinese government is particularly concerned with. Now, of course, one of the interesting things about China is that they have, even partly because they've got terrible air, they've polluted themselves more than they've polluted the rest of the world, that they are seriously interested in investing in the environment and trying to improve it in China. And I think by doing that in China, that will obviously have a knock-on effect around the rest of the world, because we're all linked environmentally. I believe that is something that is very concerning for them regarding Trump and the kind of people that he has put into his administration that is going to be in charge of environmental, the sanctity of the environment in the US.
Yeah,
so that's a big worry, and that's something that I've heard people talk about in China just over the last month.
Interesting, because it does appear that this is an opportunity for China to take the lead on
Yes.
something that worries everybody in the world.
Absolutely.
So amazing, whether we call it an opportunity or a challenge, it's a big deal. So when you talk about the impact of all of this, I know about the factory workers. What about these millennials that are being pumped out of all the colleges in China and to maybe not so many jobs? What's the deal there?
Yeah, well, that is interesting, because I think the Chinese generally, it doesn't matter where they are a fantastic bunch of innovators and entrepreneurs. So it seems to me, from my experience from the business that we run in China, that if they don't get a job with their degree, they go on and get another one or get more skills to make them even more employable in this great competitive marketplace. Or they to figure out that they're going to start something themselves. One of the newest parts of our FT Chinese website is an innovation platform that we've got set up there. And that is quite new, but getting incredible traction because people are interested in, if they can't depend on the state to help them get rich, and I think those days have passed, then you've got to depend on yourself. So I'm finding this amazing number of people wanting to engage with each other about getting businesses off the ground, getting business ideas off the ground. We had 8 interns in 2016 over the summer in our Beijing office. Every single one of them frightened the bejesus out of me because they were
really
wonderfully educated, sophisticated in their worldview, they'd travelled, they were making up ideas while they were working for the FT. They were impressive. One of them is now moved to the US. She's just finishing a degree in the US, and we're going to give her an internship in New York for a year as well to see how that goes. So there are very, very, very impressive young people. But I do think you're right with when does their enthusiasm dissolve or dissipate into disappointment if they can't fulfill the very, very ambitious goals that they've set themselves.
Well, one of the things you're saying that I'm finding really fascinating is around this whole idea of innovation and entrepreneurship, because there is a view, I think, a strong one in the Western world, that we're the innovators. They're still thinking of China merely as, what did you call it, the engine,
factory of the world.
The factory of the world. And that because of the rote learning in their educational system, that they don't really have the basics for what it takes to create innovation. But the fact is, you're not the first one who's told me it's amazing what is happening there, especially among the young. So I think that's going to be a surprise to the rest of the world that are not really aware of this right now. So when I ask people where will innovation come from, we used to say, well, the expats or the people that go away, get educated, and come back and practice it here. But it now sounds like they're homegrown. That whatever is happening in their schooling, they're coming back and getting ideas of their own, as you said, and maybe even doing it collaboratively with other young people. That's new, right?
That is relatively new, I think. There was that view that they didn't know how to colour outside the lines because they were kept strictly within their Chinese characters, literally and metaphysically. So I think that that has changed, and I'm going to lots of different conferences now where people are bemoaning the fact that STEM subjects are not being taught sufficiently well in the West.
Elsewhere,
right. And certainly not being taught to women, to girls, so that you're finding that women are not coming into into technology, into engineering, into these subjects that are preparing people for careers that are looking at the future and technology and innovation on that side of the coin. Whereas you're finding in China and Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., STEM subjects are very, very important for everybody. So perhaps it's a little bit of that catching up as well. You've got these kids that are really good at maths, science, biology, chemistry, physics. They're good. And that from when your kids go from the system here to a traditional Western system, as my own kids did when they left Hong Kong and went to high school, they were head and shoulders ahead above everybody else that they were competing against or going to school with.
Probably to other people's surprise.
To their own surprise.
Interesting. So it sounds like in the end, you're highly optimistic about China's future.
I am optimistic that. Yeah, I am optimistic. I just, having seen it, watched it at closed hands for such a long time, I've seen them come in and out of lots of different conundrums. The one conundrum that could trip them up is the whole issue around control and corruption. And I know Xi Jinping has been doing a lot of work to set examples around corruption, that it will not be tolerated, that it is being routed out. But there is a whole patronage system in China that is going to be almost impossible, I think, in this or even another generation to totally remove.
It's entrenched.
Yes, it's highly entrenched. Mm-hmm. And I think that the more people, despite the great internet, the great wall of China that is there running across the country and seen from space, but also blocking freedom of communication and access, I think that is something that they need to accommodate in a different way.
It's an interesting balance, isn't it? Because it sounds like young people especially are finding their voice.
Yep.
If you become entrepreneurial, already you're asking questions that you didn't ask before. So are you seeing that? Are people in China more likely to speak up now? Certainly they've spoken up about pollution.
Yep.
Do they sort of pick their subjects? Because in the West, people are convinced that everybody gets punished for speaking up at all in China, which is clearly not the case. So where does that all fit?
I think that China's opposition to free speech has become is still entrenched, just as entrenched as lots of other things. It's all about control. And Xi Jinping, the way he's running his administration is about control plus. So I believe that people are a bit more sophisticated about how they're communicating. People have VPNs. So
explain that.
A VPN is a dongle that you can then, or a site you can log into for a fee that gives you access to websites that are banned in China. And when I say websites banned in China, I'm not talking about hard porn. I'm talking about stuff like Google or Facebook or whatever. Of course, China's got fantastic and highly successful alternatives to Facebook. They've got WeChat, Weibo, they've got all sorts of things that have come up to be great mass communication tools within the country. But people want more. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's a real touch point. They haven't got that worked out. It is more sophisticated because, for example, with our own content in Chinese, we find that instead of a comprehensive block of our site, we'll have individual stories blocked. So,
gosh, when you think about how many people that involves that have to be involved in that censorship activity,
well I don't know.
Thousands
or
of
is
people.
it just thousands of algorithms, or just one algorithm? I don't know.
By searching on a word, you mean? But I've heard that they really do have literally thousands.
I'm sure they do, and I think there are different arms of the government playing different roles on that. So I think probably there are some arms like the SCIO, the State Council Information Office, that would be much more sophisticated than, say, the local police, who also keep an eye on what goes on the internet. But it is a tightrope we walk, particularly in the media industry, every day, frankly. But I think that is an Achilles heel that could bite them if they're not careful.
Isn't it interesting, the irony here about the ambition, the drive, the excitement about young people in China especially, but all over Asia really, and the West, where we feel there's a lot of self-satisfaction, a lot of, do we really have to do this? This is going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
So what else? I haven't asked you, I'm sure, some questions that might be some things that you think about in terms of the shift that's occurred, or the future that we have to look forward to in terms of how we communicate between these two parts of the world. Anything I haven't asked you about?
Well, there is the whole issue of people feeling less secure in their home country where they live or when they travel. The prevalence of solo terrorists versus much more organised terrorism. So suddenly you can be in a market in Germany and you can be mowed down by a truck, or whereas before you might be worried if you were going into a hotspot, if you were travelling via Afghanistan or whatever. So there is a people's psyches, I think, have been sharpened as a result of that, and their antennae are on much more, well, 24/7 probably. So I think the one thing about being out here is that I feel quite secure. I mean, that's probably a mistake on my part, but I think that there is a sense that China's attitude to international relations and is such that it's your business. Your business is your business. My business is my business. I don't expect you to interfere in my business, but occasionally I will interfere in your business, has been foreign policy. But I don't see external terrorism coming to China anytime soon. They have their own issues within the country with the Muslim population, the Uyghurs in the far northwest, but I don't see other influences coming into China and taking hold, partly because of the vigilance they have about who comes in and out of the country, but also because I think that they wield a big stick and they give the impression they'd be happy to bang you on the head with it.
They don't look vulnerable.
No, they don't. The only thing that I feel, the only part I feel where I feel they are weak and appear weak, if they're not weak, they appear it, in this region is their relations with North Korea.
Yes.
That border is slightly porous. And also you can't, I defy anyone to say they know exactly what's going on in North Korea. And maybe China knows exactly what's going on because the dear leader goes there on a train and has his teeth done. I have no idea. But that is a worry, I think, for Korea, for Japan, for lots of places, because now we know that they have missiles that can reach as far as those countries. So I think that China has its own problems, domestic problems, but I for some reason, and as I say, I could be totally wrong, I don't feel that external, international terrorism is likely to be imported to China anytime soon. And I include Hong Kong with that, I think.
So what a couple of interesting decades for you to have lived through all of this. And it looks like, I think something you said in the very beginning, this could be the beginning of a new age, truly. We used to see covers on magazines, probably also in your newspaper, in your media, about this being the century of China. But I'm beginning to think people are really convinced that may be it, certainly of Asia.
Yeah.
So we'll see
what
happens. Yeah.
We'll certainly see.
Yeah, go ahead.
The one negative thing just about Hong Kong, my home, there's been lots of positive things that have happened here over the last 21 years, although I think we're in a bit of a muddle politically at the moment.
It appears so.
I'm fascinated to see how it plays out, although slightly bemused about how we got here in the first place. But I do worry about this sense of them and us between the mainlanders and the local Hong Kong Chinese. Because I think that there's no escaping the symbiosis of the countries, and I think that China has become a little bere more attuned to that. You don't see quite so many tourist groups coming through who were people who were really quite disgustingly and disgracefully referred to as cockroaches.
From mainland China.
Yes,
into Hong Kong, yes.
And that's pretty awful because the Chinese diaspora is everywhere, and you would like to think that there would be a similar kind of accommodation here about their own countrymen who emigrate or travel to this very, very successful island and territory. So that is a flashpoint that seems to have subsided a little bit, but I don't think it'll take much to light that fire again.
And the Hong Kongers really do have a prejudice against mainland Chinese, don't they?
They do. I think the people who don't have much contact tend to have quite a lot of negative contact. In my own office building, There's 79 floors, and increasingly there are 8 shares companies setting up their headquarters here. So I'm seeing a lot more of your educated, travelling abroad type mainland Chinese person, and I can hand on heart say they're just as rude or just as kind as most Australians or anyone else that you meet. You get the good uns and the bad uns. But I think it's that you need to have that variety of society to be able to make an educated or just make a decision about how you're going to behave based on a broader experience of those people rather than a bunch of characters that are whooshed through on a 48-hour shopping and sightseeing trip that begins at Ocean Park and ends at some vile shopping centre in Kowloon.
Well, you know, in a way that's true of what we're doing with these conversations, really, isn't it? That it's really because we don't know, the ignorance that we all have of places that we haven't had a chance to live in, that we think we know the conversation, but we really don't.
No.
In fact, we don't know what we're talking about unless we've been there and experienced it, and that's never been more true than
and Google makes into experts of us all, right? We think we know because we can dial it up, but nothing really takes the place of face-to-face experience, conversations, observations.
Well, that's a great place to end this. Thank you so much, Angela. This has been terrific to get your insights. Thanks for taking part.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you.